Hi everyone, Mike Verta here. Today I'm going to be demonstrating some playing techniques which you can use to help make your virtual instrument performances a bit more realistic. Now, before I begin, although I'm not going to be talking about which samples you should use, which sample libraries you should buy, one thing I am going to recommend, especially for woodwinds, brass, and strings, is that you choose samples which feature dynamic crossfading controlled from a continuous controller like an expression pedal or a modulation wheel. And what this means is they've taken an instrument like, say, a French horn, and they've recorded it at different dynamic markings, at piano, say, and at mezzo forte, and at forte, and then using the mod wheel, you can blend smoothly between the different samples. And this is an absolutely critical feature to have in order to get a realistic performance. Now, there's other ways of switching between these samples. Some use velocity sensitivity, where the harder or softer you press, it switches between samples. That can be very difficult to control because they're often very sensitive. Just a slight difference in pressure, and it triggers, the difference between a piano sample and a mezzo piano sample. And there's a jump between the two recordings, and it's very difficult to make that smooth. So I don't generally use that method. Other samples use key switches, where one key will make a forte sample, another key will be a mezzo forte, and so on, and it's got the same problem. It's not usually the case that in the midst of a line you are suddenly making a leap in dynamics. It's not generally desirable in a performance. Some further still combine key switches with modulation as a sort of volume control, leading to this weird situation where you could trigger a forte sample, something very loud and biting, and yet use the mod wheel to make it that same timbral quality, only quiet, which is a total reality mismatch. It's impossible. You can't play as loud as you possibly could, but also be quiet. So I avoid those sorts of scenarios and setups because I've never successfully been able to get them to behave realistically. So again, my preferred point of input is dynamic crossfading using a mod wheel. And I'll show you why. If there's a cardinal rule for virtual instrument performances, especially, again, woodwinds, brass, and strings, I'd say it's to remember breath and bow. Most of us here inputting are using a keyboard. We're keyboard players, often piano players. And you can't perform a French horn the same way that you would a piano. You can. You can. But you can't do that on a French horn. A French horn section can't perform that, not that way, not in a way that's convincing or stylistically appropriate. So don't play like you're playing a keyboard. You have to think and play like a French horn player would. Let's say, for example, here I've pulled up a trumpet sample, and it's a dynamically crossfaded sample. There you go with my mod wheel. You see my left finger going up like this. Full range. Now, if you're just going to sound, say, a concert G on this trumpet sample. Let's put our volume somewhere here in the middle, somewhere like a mezzo forte, and just sound a note. You get this. Okay, it's a very distinct attack with a sustain that holds. Okay, it's perfectly fine, except that's not how a trumpet player is going to play that note. Here's how a trumpet player is going to actually play that note. Okay, there's a sweep and a push to a peak. I'll do it slowly and exaggerate it. There's a push like this to a peak and a pull back for the sustain. Okay. Okay, curve looks like this. So we've got a push up, peak, and a sustain, usually with a tail at the end. Now, how much of that a player does, it depends on the context. Sometimes it's very fast, sometimes very slow, sometimes it's more subtle than not. But almost without exception, it takes some breath to get that note sounding. And usually there's that little peak after the initial attack. Without it, things tend to sound very mechanical. So again, how subtle or how much you use of it depends on the context, but It's a good skill to have, a good technique to practice, and it may take some practice to be able to do it quickly. Now you notice there with the staccato notes, obviously with a staccato note, maybe you don't need it. So in the midst of a line, okay, this action with your left hand here, something to practice and practice a lot. Okay, and that's true for trumpets and for, here, let's do it with a little French horn sample. Watch my left hand, it was going all over the place there. Sometimes I was scooping up more so than other. Made that first note, getting in a little gently. Here's my pull, and I did a little of that. And maybe for these sort of staccato notes, you don't use it at all. Got a little swell there. You can play around with the amount of swell or breath that you use, but you can't neglect it. Now with strings, I tend to use the same technique, only to a much subtler degree, but I use it because there's a real unnatural jump in there. There's a little push. If you saw my left hand there was just a little goose on every one of those notes, and it makes a difference. Often a difference that you can feel as much as you can hear it. But like I said, for me, I've never performed a line. I don't think I perform an instrument without it. Now, does this work with chords? Absolutely, it works with chords. Here's some French horns. Okay, but there's another technique that I use with chords, which I recommend. As keyboard players, piano players especially, generally when we're playing chords, our goal is to have the notes all sound together at precisely the exact same instant, when they have the hammers all strike together, usually with the same intensity. But the truth is that in, say, a trumpet section, even if it's the best trumpet section in the world and they're really tight and they've played together forever, they're not going to have that exact uniformity in time. There's always going to be some mismatch between when the first chair plays and the third chair and the second chair plays. Even if it's just milliseconds, they'll have a little of that or this, or there'll be some sort of roll in there. And the human brain is very, very sensitive to that sort of thing. So as another rule, when I'm performing chords, I almost always roll my chords a little bit. To slow it down, I kind of do this. I just do it very quickly. Just a little bit. And it does a couple of things. Generally speaking, the attacks for these instruments are so mathematically precise, or so identical, that when you do successive chords, you can hear it. It reveals itself as it being as being samples. So by rolling the chords ever so slightly, it tends to obfuscate. You don't get to hear the exact attack of each instrument happen as well. So it masks the sample quality of a little bit. So that's another thing. In addition to the push and pull, also a little bit of that rolling. Okay, very difficult. I mean, without the mod wheel, it just reads as mechanical to me anyway. And so I use that quite a lot. Okay, and now one thing you might notice is those two performances are not exactly the same. One was a little bit better than the other in some ways, and I will often perform these parts many times. In order to get them to sound right. But that is That's the spirit of it. That's the essence of it. That's the human of it, and that's what I consider one of the most crucial components to making a realistic performance. Okay. Okay. So let's look at the MIDI graph for this little part for a second. Now, what you see here are, you can see in the velocity curve, you can see my mod wheel changes. You can see my intent. You can see the overall shape of it. There's all sorts of little moments in there where my finger was drifting a little bit, and you can see the notes are not striking exactly together. This represents the ideal profile for what your MIDI data should look like on one of your instrument performances. There's a tendency today to do things like quantize the rhythms, to make all of these trumpet notes sound at exactly the same time. Similarly, there's a tendency to take these velocity curves and draw them, using tools like linear drawing tools. The problem with both of those approaches is it's entirely non-human. Human beings aren't quantized. They've never been. They never will be. We don't perform with mathematical precision. And similarly, our velocity and dynamic curves that we generate with our breath and our bow are not precise like this. So when you do this, you start to just dial the soul right out of your performance. Part of recreating a human performance means embracing the humanity, means embracing the imperfections, embracing the time problems, the asymmetries. That's where the beauty and the poetry and the humanity of the performance is. So rather than spend your time editing, MIDI data, take your time performing and reperforming until you get something right. And sometimes it takes a while, especially if you're playing a complex part, or if you're switching instruments. That's something I will do with key switches, where I'll switch. For example, my French horns, I have a legato, and then I have one that is not legato, so I can do chords. So if you're doing some sort of part, there's a performance. There's some things were good about it, some things were not. First time I've ever done it. But I would rather now go back and do that and correct the things in a performance than go back and try to deal with the MIDI data, because the second it's no longer my hands working together, it's very likely something that a human being wouldn't do. The one way to describe what you're looking at, certainly here in the continuous controller data, is it's very, very human, and that is our goal. Or it's not. If you're not trying to recreate the sound of an orchestra in human performances, well, then quantize all day. But certainly for these sorts of instruments, this is absolutely what I recommend doing to get the most realistic performances.